Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about elsewhere, mostly Necromancer, because I think that's what most people are interested in. I will talk about my experience at the playtest with the Necromancer, what I played and so on. I will also talk about abilities and passives that really stood out to me. Please keep in mind I have played a very early version of Elsewhere and the Necromancer, so things might change again till the update goes to public test server or to the live server even. Public test server should launch around mid-April. I will be streaming a lot on twitch.tv/AlcastHQ and I will be updating my website accordingly, link in the description below. First I want to talk about my experience at the playtesting, and afterwards I will talk about each of the skills that I can remember. I played a Magical Necromancer in PvE and a Stamina Necromancer in PvP, and trust me, both those setups felt quite amazing and actually very powerful. I played a ranged Magical Necromancer. The setup felt very unique, especially because you have some sort of minigame within the class. So you can cast abilities that summon skeletons or skeletal mobs that when they die they actually leave corpses behind. And you can use those corpses to buff up some of your other abilities so they do more overall damage. So when I tried to figure out a good rotation, you always had to make sure that there is corpses on the ground when you use certain abilities so they get even stronger. The Stamina Necromancer plays kinda similar. You also have a lot of stamina morphs in the Necromancer class skill lines, believe it or not. I will get into more detail about these when I talk about each skill individually. The Stamina Necromancer I played in Battlegrounds was a medium armor build, very bursty because we have this Skeletal Bomber that will run towards enemies quite fast and explode in AoE damage. The biggest thing that really stood out to me about the Necromancer were the ultimates he has. But now, before we get to the ultimates, let's talk about each ability on their own. The Reaper skill line is the first one I want to talk about. So the first ability, Burning Skull, has a Stamina and a Magicka morph. For example, the Magicka morph, every third cast you did had like a 10% extra damage tick. Or even a little bit higher, I can't remember. So it was very powerful, and especially in PvE, it hit like a truck. The second one, Skeletal Mage. Here you also have a Magicka, Skeletal Mage morph, and the Stamina is a Stamina Archer. So we have two morphs. And again, this is one of the abilities that creates a corpse on the ground that you can use to buff other abilities, like for example the Graveyard. But first, the Skeletal Bomber. This one also had a Magicka and a Stamina morph. That's why I said before that Stamina Necro has a lot of burst potential. So those bombers run really fast, and basically it's a fire and forget missile. So you target at the player, you press a button and it will run there crazy fast. Now the bomber can also get snared and stuff like that, so it's not too strong. Very important. And I think you can even stun it. Then the Graveyard is a ground-based AoE ability that deals a lot of damage. And like I said before, the skeletal summon and the bomber both leave a corpse on the ground. And the Graveyard, if there's a corpse on the ground, the Graveyard will consume the corpse and deal increased damage. So you really want to make sure that there's a corpse on the ground, so your AoE damage gets amplified. Siphon Energy is basically a sustain tool, so you drain a corpse and it basically gives you Magicka or Stamina back. I'm not 100% sure anymore how it worked. Now the Bone Dragon Breath, that ultimate got replaced by a Flesh Atronach. So you have a Flesh Atronach raising and stomping on the ground. It's quite a big AoE, I think a 10-meter radius or something, or even a little bit bigger, I can't recall correctly. However, major vulnerability. That dude, when we tested it, applied major vulnerability to anyone standing in that zone. Now it took like 1.5 seconds for it to arise, so it wasn't that easy to position. But especially in Battlegrounds, once an enemy got hit by the Flesh Atro, which also deals a crazy amount of damage every time he stomps, I think he stomped 3 times. Also applies major vulnerability. Most people died afterwards because it's just too much incoming damage. So yeah, that Flash Shotgun arc, if they didn't change it, it's gonna be freaking strong. It was still... I'm not sure, I think it cost 200 ultimate points. I'm not 100% sure anymore. Now in terms of passive in the Reaper skills, the only thing I can remember is there was one passive that actually increased your spell and weapon critical, depending on how much Reaper skills you had on your bar. So while I was testing the Magical Necro in PvE, I had 5 abilities of the Necro on the bar, because there's a lot of useful stuff. And in PvP, I think I used 4. Why that many and how much? So during our playtesting, each of those skills slotted increased your weapon and spell crit. In Execute, it was only active in Execute, by 10%. So it was very easy to reach 100% during Execute. That's what I'm trying to say. It was really easy to reach that 100%. Because you always have like 3 to 5 or maybe even 6 Necromancer damage abilities if you're very damage focused. So yeah, that's a lot of extra crit in Execute. They might tune those numbers. I'm pretty sure they will, because it's a little bit strong. Bone Tyrant is the tanking skill line. Now the Bone Fetish is basically a totem that you can place on the ground. I think up to 28 meters if you choose the right morph. And after 2 or 3 seconds it applies a debuff and fears the enemy, if I recall correctly. Taste of Life, I cannot really remember. Impaling Spikes is basically a AoE ability that snares and, like it already says, impales the enemies. The Bone Armor was also pretty cool. So basically, the Bone Armor gives you the major resistance buffs, and at the end of the duration, you generate the corpse, because like it kind of it forms a pile of bones because of the Bone Armor that falls off at the end of the duration. And the morphs, one of the morphs actually pulls enemies to you, so it's kind of like an automatic chain. And you don't have to do anything. You don't need to block, you don't need to aim at him. It just will pull him automatically to you. But will give him CSU immunity on the other hand. And the other morph decrease the cost of your summons if you use some. I can't really recall what consumed it, but it consumes some corpses around you. And I think it heals. Or it gives you ulti back, something like that. I'm not 100% sure anymore. Bone Colossus, now this here is where it gets interesting. So you basically transform into a Bone Colossus. While transformed, you get, at least we gained in the playtesting, 30k extra health. Once you were transformed, it was basically impossible to kill you in Battlegrounds, because you had so much health. And one of the morphs had an aura that drained enemies' health and gave it to you. The other morph was AoE bash, if I recall correctly. So this was a very strong ultimate, however it costs 300 ultimate points. So you really want to make sure whether to use it or not. Now, the ultimate was very good defensive wise, but it kinda lacked damage stats, so you don't really get stronger in terms of damage output. It just makes you defensively very strong. Because it costs so much ultimate, I'm not really sure what to think about it. The last thing I remember about this skill line is one of the passives that basically applies 2k health to you. Now this doesn't sound very strong or very good for a tank setup, but if you're a healer or a damage dealer, 2k extra health is a lot. I was basically running around with 20k health on my Magical Necro all time. Living Death is the healing skill tree. I can't really recall a lot, to be honest here, but I remember people that actually played the healer. They said it was very powerful, especially because most of the abilities were very useful for them. Again, I haven't played the healer, so I'm not really 100% sure what it does anymore. The Skeletal Mender, it's basically a monster that you can... a skeletal mage that you summon that will heal you from time to time. Restoring Tether was when you drain the corpse and people were standing between the corpse and your healer. They actually got extra heals, and the heal was really freaking strong. Then we also had Release Essence. If I recall correctly, this was some sustain buff. I'm not 100% sure anymore what it does. Now, for the ultimate, probably people really wonder about that. The ultimate, what it does is it resurrects team members. Now, the cap was at 3. And if I recall correctly, you also regained some resources and some other stuff. And this was especially useful in a dungeon, for example, or in PvP as well, battlegrounds or a dungeon. Because you can run this as a backup ultimate. Well, your whole group is dead. You press one button and they're back up ready to go. Which is really cool. So this ultimate is really cool. Again, it's more like a backup ulti because it doesn't have any, like... It doesn't boost your stats or whatsoever. It's more like, oh, everybody's dead and I want to rest people. Yeah, we have to wait for the PTS to really check out those abilities in detail. Because that's just what I remember off my head, because we were not allowed to take any notes during the playtesting. If you want those pictures, they are on my Necromancer preview article on my website, link in the description below. So that's more or less it for now. This is just kind of like a small preview of what I remember. I will go into more detail and showcase all the ability once the Necromancer is on the public test server. If you have any questions, you can always join our community Discord. I will also put the link in the description. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit that juicy like button. Thanks for watching and have a nice day. Cheers.